morning. We do continue today with our Advent theme of peace. If you've been working your way through the devotional guide, you've seen that again and again from cover to cover, and I want us to focus on that theme again today. Last week, and also as alluded to in some places in the devotional guide, we were introduced to a little village in World War II France. The village is called Le Chambon, and the Trocmé family who lived there in the last century. Pastor Andy is who we talked about last week, and his ministry there and his struggle to find a sense of place, a sense of belonging, struggled to sort of reconcile his own personal beliefs with this growing sort of pervasive evil as the Third Reich was starting its expanse across Europe. And today, I want to focus on another member of the Trocmé family. Maggie, or Magda, Maggie, Andy's wife. They met in New York when he was there to study at the seminary, and she was there to study for social work. And then they came back to Europe where they had their roots in order to be married and to make their home. The question I want us to entertain today is this: how do we maintain peace? And specifically, how do we maintain peace, staying faithful in times of anxiety and stress and strain of the everyday? Now, I realize that may sound like a strange set of questions to sort of group together as one. At first glance, it would seem as though anxiety and everyday stress and strain are two different categories, unless you happen to be around someone who is anxious about the everyday, in which case you know that these two go hand in hand. Our text today from 2 Peter also combines these two themes, these two topics. These are people who are anxious. Simon Peter, the rock, is writing to them to offer encouragement. But they are anxious about something very specific. In their case, they are anxious about the coming judgment of God. And to be clear, their anxiety about the coming judgment of God is not like the type of anxiety that we might hear most about today. Usually today when we hear someone talking about judgment, it has to do with a heavy-handed sort of thing that folks should cower and fear in the presence of. But not so in first century Palestine, not so in the first century ancient Roman world. These are people who are eager for the judgment of God because their lives are miserable. Their lives are full of suffering. Their lives are full of the type of injustice that we would expect to find in one of the Old Testament prophets or in a psalm of lament, describing how the wicked always seem to get ahead and prosper, and the righteous always seem to be put down. They are anxious about the day of judgment because they are eager for it to arrive, to reassure them that the stance they have taken, that the road they have walked all the while has been, in fact, the better choice. Yet not only are they anxious, they also struggle in sort of the everyday workings of their lives. They struggle to remain hopeful. They struggle to remain faithful in the face of what seems to be an unjust balance of the weights. And to this situation of anxiety and everyday struggle, Simon Peter writes a word of encouragement. Back in the village of Le Chambon, they knew what anxiety was all about. These were people who read the news. These were people who heard the radio broadcast describing that starting in Paris and then in other large cities and making their way southward across the occupied zone of northern France. People were starting to be told that if they were Jewish, not only would they need to step out into their community and go to a place where they would have to sign a registration, now they were being required to affix to themselves and wear on their outward clothing an indication, the star in bright yellow or gold, making sure everyone around them, and in particular the authorities, were aware that they were Jewish. In fact, it was not just a name on a page anymore, it was an everyday reality, the threat of persecution and its real presence among them for those who wore the star. The people in Chambon, though they lived in a rural place high atop a volcanic plateau, they realized that this was spreading in their world and moving their direction. They began to hear about the same time as we talked about last week that Pastor Andy made his way to an internment camp, trying to find some way that he could make a more tangible contribution for those who were being oppressed at that time. About that same time, people in the village started to hear about roundups taking place. Government officials going into public places and going into homes and wandering the streets of cities, rounding up people who were wearing the star and trying to find those who refused to wear it and yet were Jewish nonetheless. Eventually, the occupation spread from the north into the south, into the region where Le Chambon was located. And they began to see German officials, not just French police, but now actual German Gestapo and actual German officials coming through their area, even coming into their little town. And with a deep breath, in August of 1942, the community knew what would follow. When a representative of the youth movement within the Vichy regime came expecting a parade, expecting the finest foods, and instead was met with a delegation from Trocmé's own school, who stepped forward at the end of the day and delivered him a letter in person that said, "We know what is going on in Paris, and we know what is happening in Lyon, and we know what is happening in all of these places, and we expect that it will happen here, and so we want you to know where we stand. That in this community, not only do we see with eyes wide open what it is that you are doing, and not only do we stand against it in principle, we want you to know that we are actively harboring in secret Jewish persons of all ages and backgrounds." It was as if the young people of the community said, "Here we are, in plain sight, just so we understand each other." So it was an anxious time. But as was illustrated in that letter, it was also a time of everyday struggle. Just imagine a village of only a couple thousand people responding after their pastor had gone to the internment camp and met that American Quaker, Burns Chalmer, who had heard Pastor Andy saying over and over again, "What is it that I can do? How may I help? Where can I stand with those who are suffering and oppressed?" And finally Chalmers sort of scratched his head and said, "Well, could your village take a few children?" And now, just a few short months later, and in particular after the letter was delivered to the Vichy official, there were hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of persons, children and moms and dads and refugees and French Jews who could make their way to the village. And a couple of thousand people were struggling every day to hide and feed and clothe and care for these individuals. How do we stay faithful in times of anxiety and everyday stress and strain? Our passage today suggests a couple of ways. Look with me at verse 11 of 2 Peter chapter 3, as we heard read a moment ago. Since all these things are to be dissolved in this way, a reference to the earlier part of the chapter about how the day of judgment will come. Since all these things are to be dissolved in this way, what sort of persons ought you to be in leading lives of holiness and godliness? It's an interesting phrase, holiness and godliness. In English translations, this is the most prevalent translation. The NIV and the Common English Bible render it, "You must live holy and godly lives." The Living Bible exclaims what holy and godly lives we should be living. Marybeth's cousin in the Good News Bible translates it, "Lives should be holy and dedicated to God." Clarence Jordan said, "We should live with dedication and deep concern." And more recently, Eugene Peterson writes, "Do your very best to be found living at your very best in purity and in peace." I would also commend Deacon Brian's prayer about inward and outward peace and holiness this morning. Godliness. What a big topic. Godliness. How can we wrap our minds around this? Literally, the Greek is translated something like to stand in awe toward. To stand in awe toward something or someone. Those of you who have been to the Grand Canyon and felt your knees quake beneath you, or walked out the ramp at Rupp Arena. Either one, you've experienced this sort of wonder and awe. But other translations are words like reverence. And there's even a particular context in which this means to live out a sense of duty to your family. And I believe that actually may be the closest sort of understanding to what it is that Simon Peter is describing in our passage today. After all, in our little song that we're doing each week at the lighting of the candle, when we sing Jesus, and then there's a second name. It's a name of prophecy. It's a name of promise. It's a name that appears in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and appears once again in Luke and in Matthew. Emmanuel, he will be called. And what does that word mean, Emmanuel? God with us. A sense of family, a sense of duty to family might give us the closest understanding to that name of Jesus, that name that he comes to fulfill, God with us. We, if we are to be godly, are to be with the people most in need. We are to be present to the people most in need. We are to be in the company of the people most in need. So for Maggie Chalkmay, she ended up facing some serious questions about what it was to live out a sense of duty to family, a sense of godliness in her life. It wasn't long after that August 1942 visit by the government official that Andy's name ended up on a list. Not as a person who was Jewish. Everybody knew the Protestant pastor of the Protestant church in this little country town was not Jewish. But he was a troublemaker. He was someone who was openly assisting folks who were Jewish in trying to survive and trying to make it through this impeding sense of evil. And it wasn't long after that 3 government vehicles pulled up in front of the presbytery there. They stood out like a sore thumb. They actually had gasoline to run on, which most folks didn't during the war. It was clear officials had come to arrest Pastor Andy and take him away. He wasn't home. He was out visiting parishioners in the countryside, and what did Maggie do? Flee? Despair? Run to Andy? None of the above. She invited them to dinner, brought them into her home, sat them at her dining room table where she had entertained so many guests over the last several years, and fed them as they wept into their soup about what it was they had come to do and the orders that they knew they would execute. In doing so, she assured that Andy would come home and be arrested and taken away. She also assured that everyone else on that list would be able to run into the woods or would be able to jump into a vehicle of their own and move on down the country road to find a neighbor or a farmhouse or some other village where they could hide. Andy's arrest only lasted about a month only. It's easy for me to say. And while he was away, Maggie again faced questions about what she should do. You probably can anticipate that nothing in the village changed while Andy was gone. Maggie made sure of that. Their ministry together did not miss a beat. After all, the private school that we talked about last week that Andy and Pastor Tace, his old seminary friend, had started, it was Maggie's idea all along. She had been shaping the curriculum all along. She had been ministering to the students all along. And so without Andy in the way to mess things up, Maggie went right on. She did, in a time of anxiety, what she had always done, living out godliness. Yes, Andy was taken away, and she was heartbroken, and she was anxious about his well-being. But in the meantime, there were children walking up the road, running for their lives, children to be brought in out of the cold. There were meals to be put on. There were lessons to teach. There were repairs to be made to their centuries-old home. There were visits to make on behalf of the local church, and there was curriculum to revise in the school. She went on in her duty to her faith family, and her godliness shone through. But what for holiness? What about this other attribute that is mentioned in verse 11? What is it to be holy? What is it to be sacred? But to be set apart for service. To be set apart for something special. To be set apart for something that only those who were called and equipped could do. We are called to be holy, as Simon Peter is describing. And Maggie seems to have taken this holiness to heart. After Andy's name appeared on the list, he was arrested and taken away, but he was brought back after a few months. He was not murdered. But because his name was on that list, it began to appear on other lists. And there was a knock on their door one day at the presbytery where they were informed by a low-ranking German official that he himself had seen Andy's name on a list of those who were to be arrested again and deported and taken to be executed. This time there was no question what the outcome would be if he were, in fact, taken from the home. And Andy sort of descended into a deep spiritual crisis. What should he do? What would be the better path? He seemed to be in a lose-lose situation. On the one hand, he could stay there with his people and almost assuredly be killed. And while that might make him a martyr and it might make people around the world sympathetic to his cause, it probably would mean that the young people in the community would suddenly become sympathetic to the idea of the freedom fighters and put themselves in harm's way, and they too would be killed. On the other hand, there was the idea that he might run. He might flee the village. and live in hiding for as long as it took. And he was afraid that if he did, his absence would mean that their movement, their ministry in the community would somehow fall apart. In the end, he ran, but mostly because his family begged him to run, essentially saying to him, we can hold this thing together while you're away. And this time, rather than lasting several weeks, it lasted several months. And as you would expect, Maggie never missed a beat. She had been a social worker, and by now the people in the community were more than just children living in children's homes or living at the public school. Now they were tucked away in farmhouses and village houses, and the people of the community, as we will explore more in a couple of weeks, were learning what it was to welcome these people into their homes. Now thousands of children and women and men had come into the village and into the region. And the ministry, not only did it not falter, not only did it not follow apart, it flourished, it expanded in the months after Pastor Andy fled for his safety. And Maggie, despite her large family and despite the questions and the anxiety of her own children, Maggie too opened her own home and received 2 Jewish women who came and stayed with her through the end of the war. Verse 14 reads, "Therefore, beloved, while you are waiting for these things, strive to be found by Him at peace." Peace. What might we do in order to be God with us, in order to embrace that high standard, in order to live out that high calling? What might we do to be present within the deep anxieties of our world? And how have we been set apart for service? How have we been called to lives of holiness? Such things, such questions, such conclusions, such practices lead to peace, regardless of what external factors may be closing in on us, regardless of the threat of loss or violence or hurt or sorrow. Such roads lead to peace because they walk in the way of Christ Jesus. He is our peace. And He has been with us all the while. The end of this passage, it is clear that Simon Peter is imagining in his mind's eye what the conversation will be when the trumpet shall sound and Christ shall descend. What will it look like? What will it sound like? And he says, we should be found at peace. We should be like the person who hears the knock at the door and walks through the door without any question of who it is that is arriving, and opens the door and embraces the one who has been long awaited with these words, "I knew you would come. I knew you would be here. I knew you were on your way because you've been in my heart the entire time I have been waiting." It is that one, as Deacon Brian has prayed, who offers us perfect peace. Jesus Himself is the peace that passes understanding. And today, as we are considering a journey with Him, a journey of God with us, a journey that overcomes anxiety and questions in the everyday, it is only the life of Christ that ushers us into the presence of peace and remains with us there. So today, if that peace is something that eludes you, if that peace is something you've never experienced, never known, And today you recognize the call of something upon your life that is like one you've been waiting for coming to your door. If today you realize that you're ready to receive Jesus as Savior and Lord and enter into His peace, we want to give you an opportunity to do so. We're going to sing again. We're going to stand from where we've been seated. We're going to lift our voices in praise. And if you're ready to give your life to Christ, then won't you step forward from where you are, even as we sing. Won't you step forward from where you are and share what's on your heart today? Or if you recognize that you've been resting in peace but have allowed anxiety to creep into your life, if you've realized that you've been going it on your own, going it alone, and have not had the necessary conversation partners, the necessary traveling companions along this journey, we would love to welcome you into a more formal relationship in the life of this church. Won't you come and share what's on your heart today? If there's some other way that you are responding to the work of the Holy One today, we hope too that you will let that decision be made known. However it is that the Lord is at work in your life, let this be a moment of response for you. We stand now and we sing in hopes that you'll come.